Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another edition of Mr. American's Moments in History, U.S. History Edition. Today we're going to keep looking and continuing our journey in the Great Depression. And certainly, one of the great places to start here is with this iconic photo from Dorothea Lange called The Migrant Mother. And certainly, Dorothea Lange was originally hired by the FDR administration to help document the New Deal. But what she ends up discovering, and probably most iconically by this photo, is how the Great Depression was affecting people. And again, certainly a tremendous story about this particular mother who was a migrant worker, specifically making her way to California and trying to make a living for her and her two children. She's a great example of people who were affected by the Great Depression and were trying to find work any way they could. Another great example too here is from this ecological disaster, also sometimes called the Dust Bowl, but in particular storms like this called black blizzards, which certainly would have had a great effect on farmers across the southern Great Plains. So we're going to dive into that today as well. But kind of taking a look at the hard times in the United States, we're going to start with our learning target for today, and we're going to be able to identify how the Depression was a difficult time, and is part of that including how many Americans faced unemployment, as well as a loss of land, and in some cases, other property as well. Now, we've mentioned this a couple of times, and we're going to dive into it certainly today, is that the Great Depression affected different people differently. Women are included as one of those groups. Certainly during the Great Depression, women day in and day out were going to work, even though they were not earning as much as men for doing the same job. This is something unfortunate that through a lot of American history has been very common. But that doesn't mean that women weren't having success, and Frances Perkins is a great example of that. You might recall an event that we talked about previously leading up to the Progressive era called the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory. Well, Frances Perkins witnesses this fire in New York, and she works from that moment to try to make working conditions safer for the American worker. And it's thanks to Frances Perkins that there's occupancy limits in buildings and rooms, and that fire drills become mandatory, and that there are, again, these safety protocol is clearly including the proper labeling of emergency exits and also later the installation of sprinkler systems. Frances Perkins was a big part of getting that legislation through in New York, and she had so much success that FDR even tapped her to become a part of his cabinet. She's eventually going to become Secretary of Labor. And she's going to be the first woman in U.S. history to serve in a cabinet position. And of course, we can't mention the success of women without, of course, mentioning Eleanor Roosevelt. She's going to work very, very hard to campaign for women, but also for families in need during this time period. One of the things that she certainly champions, and she again redefines the role of the First Lady, is she works very hard to make sure that children can stay in school during the Great Depression, and that they receive vocational training so that they can work after receiving that training, even though there's a lack of opportunity perhaps with unemployment. She also makes sure that African Americans are included in those vocational skills, because largely, and we'll talk a little bit more about this later, the New Deal failed African Americans. Like we mentioned, though, there's this ecological disaster called the Dust Bowl that's making its way through the United States. And again, this iconic photograph is depicting sometimes what are referred to as black blizzards, again referring to the dust storms in the southern Great Plains. And they're brought on by a combination of natural occurring disasters, but also the mismanagement of soil, and some man-made elements are also a part of this. So there's a severe drought in this part of the country, and this is coupled by the farmers clearing millions of acres of sod, aka grass, for wheat farming. This increased erosion, which of course allowed for more topsoil to be taken off. And so certainly the Great Depression, one of the things you'll see, and certainly something that farmers can tell you a lot more about, is this loss of topsoil that takes place in this time period, especially in places like western Kansas, specifically what we might call like the Panhandle, or the kind of the far western part of Oklahoma, certainly northern Texas, eastern Colorado, as well as kind of like the northeastern portions of New Mexico. And again, this time period in U.S. history during the Great Depression is more commonly known as the Dust Bowl. This is a great photograph too, certainly depicting a dust storm appearing just outside of Spearman, Texas. And this again is from April of 1935. But just to kind of give you your bearings, so certainly the regions that we described, that northeastern New Mexico, northern Texas, the westernmost parts of Oklahoma, as well as the southwest portion of Kansas and the southeast portion of Colorado. But certainly you're also going to see some of that stretching up into Nebraska, Wyoming, the Dakotas, as well as Montana, also seeing some of the damage done by these dust storms, although certainly not at the same rate as, of course, the area you will see in red. And certainly Dust Bowl states are certainly also included there in the brown. Unfortunately, the Dust Bowl creates a situation where people are going to be struggling, because with so much topsoil gone and so many crops being destroyed through the Dust Bowl, you're going to have thousands of farmers who are going to end up going bankrupt. They rely on that crop. They're not going to get that crop because of these dust storms, because of the drought, because of the overall effects of the Dust Bowl. And so you're going to end up with thousands leaving and migrating to places like California. And it's here that they're going to become migrant workers. And again, migrated is a key term here. It certainly means relocate. And then migrant worker is typically somebody, again, who's moving from place to place, typically following the harvest of different fruits and vegetables, especially in California, with the idea of, certainly getting a job opportunity with that. Probably one of the more famous groups that we learn about during this time period, and specifically from Oklahoma, are called Okies. And these are people who are leaving. You would have seen in the highways between Oklahoma and California, it was almost just like a parade of cars that were making their way out to California, with this idea that perhaps there would be more job opportunity available out on the West Coast. So when we look at, just a quick check-in question here, which of the following states was not a part of the Dust Bowl? Options include California, Colorado, Oklahoma, and Texas. Pause here if you need to, but we're going to keep moving on. The best answer here is the place where many of them were going to, and that would be California. So A is your best answer there. Want to shift gears a little bit and talk about how the Great Depression actually placed the hardest burden on minority groups. And certainly, like we said, the Great Depression affects different groups differently. We've mentioned women already, but I also want to take a moment now and talk about how the Great Depression affected African Americans. During the Great Depression, you do end up with a situation where more than half, so again, over 50% of African Americans, particularly in the South, were unemployed. Again, still very highly reliant upon agriculture, and again, typically not owning their own property. African Americans are going to find themselves unemployed at a much higher rate than other groups, including white Americans. And as a result of this, you are going to see a lot of African Americans moving to northern cities in search of economic opportunity. However, they're going to face discrimination. They're going to face prejudice that's going to make it harder for them to get the opportunity, the economic opportunities that, say, white Americans are going to get. And so President Roosevelt, again, with a lot of pushing from his wife Eleanor, put together a group of advisors that, again, were known as the Black Cabinet, in order to try to deal with these issues and to try to perhaps help African Americans more specifically with the failures of the New Deal. Some of these individuals included Ralph Bunche, as well as Mary McLeod Bethune. I apologize if I mispronounce those names. Bunche in particular is going to play a really important role in the 1920s and 1930s civil rights movement, which certainly is going to lay the foundation for the later 50s and 60s civil rights movements. Some other groups I certainly want to talk about. Native Americans. Native Americans certainly were given a little bit more autonomy after World War I, as a thanks for their participation in World War I, but it's really the Indian Reorganization Act of 1939 that started to create a little bit more autonomy for specifically tribal governments. And so it restores a lot of the traditional tribal governments that existed here, and in some ways tried to lessen the role that the federal government played, and oftentimes even in some cases provided money for land purchases to help enlarge reservations. But it really gave an opportunity for Native Americans to play a bigger role in enforcing laws, policing, and creating, again, restoring those tribal governments as a way to hopefully in the future be more specific and independent of the government, and frankly hopefully get to govern themselves more. You also certainly with Mexican immigrants, you're going to see that group during the Great Depression was actually encouraged to return to Mexico as opposed to stay in the United States, and those that did stay faced a lot of discrimination, and were often seen again as the enemy because they were taking away jobs specifically from migrant workers in the southwest portion of the United States, including California. Now, with all of the hardships of the Great Depression occurring, people were looking for some sort of entertainment to help them forget about what life was like. And so as we get into this time period, we're going to be able to describe how the 30s were actually in some ways a golden age for entertainment, for literature, music, as well as other forms of art. And there predominantly were two trends that you predominantly saw emerging in the arts as we made our way through the Great Depression. They were two very different. One's kind of the magnifying glass and one's kind of the distraction. So let's talk about the distraction first, or what we call escapism. This tended to be more light or even in some cases romantic entertainment. And you're also going to see the first introductions of some films. But again, this was supposed to help people forget about the problems of the Great Depression and was meant to serve as a distraction or an escape to the hardships that were faced in this time period. The other kind of entertainment was quite the opposite. It was what we call social criticism. It basically depicts the injustice and the suffering of the Great Depression in America to really try to highlight what life was really like. So I'm going to start with escapism. And so a couple of the most iconic and certainly most popular movies of the time. First one I'm going to mention is Gone with the Wind. And certainly this is a film that hasn't aged very well, especially as we go into the 21st century. For my students, we're going to watch the trailer. We'll talk a little bit, of course, about perhaps why it hasn't aged very well. But we will do that, of course, in class. We'll watch that trailer too. The other big one, of course, is The Wizard of Oz. We mentioned this book too a little bit when we talked about the Grange, as well as certainly the populist movement that occurred within the United States as a book, but certainly becomes a movie, again, very popular. We'll make sure that we watch the trailer in class and talk a little bit about that too. You also certainly see, radio continues to be very important. You're going to see different programs as well as movies, again, becoming enormously popular during the 1930s. You also have a series, or what are often called serial programs, that were often sponsored by laundry detergent, and they become known as soap operas. So certainly if you're familiar with that term, again, that comes from the Great Depression. Those stories often sponsored, again, by laundry detergents. You also have this time period depicting several great writers, photographers like Dorothea Lange, as well as painters portraying the grim realities of the Great Depression. A little bit more of that realism, a little bit more of this is what it was really like. And Dorothea Lange is a great example of that. The migrant mother, again, like we started notes with, probably one of the more iconic photos in all of American history. And again, wasn't the original assignment, but what we get out of it is a much clearer understanding of how people are enduring, how people are trying to make their way through the Great Depression. Probably one of the more iconic authors in this time period is John Steinbeck. His two novels of Mice and Men and The Grapes of Wrath depict a little bit of this migrant worker life, especially Grapes of Wrath. You get a little bit more of the Okie story, and certainly highlights the hardships that came with those lifestyles. Of Mice and Men, it's a great example of some migrant workers making their way during the Great Depression, trying to find work. So, which novel explores the topic of family or of farm families fleeing the Dust Bowl during this time period? And again, pause if you need to. Is it A, Superman, B, Wizard of Oz, C, The Grapes of Wrath, or D, Gone with the Wind? Hopefully you picked The Grapes of Wrath. And this is kind of where we'll end things. Again, make sure, for my students, just as a check-in, make sure you're getting some of those big topics and some of those specifics. Make sure that you get your review here. And again, I believe, if I remember right, that's on page 11 of your notes. Do this as a quick check-in. For all others, I hope that maybe this will just help you make sure that you're picking up on some of the big ideas, and certainly, in some cases, a little bit of process of elimination here too, because we didn't talk about everything here, but maybe some encouraging things to make sure you look up. So, want to say thank you for everybody for listening. I hope you have a wonderful day, and I'll see you next time on Mr. Merrigan's Moments in History.